The theme of this inaugural week is Creating Tomorrow. And this morning we will explore that theme in the form of a debate on the topic of the future of conservative and liberal ideology, which is the best guide into the 21st century. This seems an appropriate debate topic for us, so close here to the Mississippi River, with its many tributaries, and a river so prominent in our history, including a key phrase in the university alma mater. Perhaps we should think about the early explorers of America's rivers and try to imagine what it must have been like for them as they moved against the current, pausing frequently to determine if they should follow the right or the left tributary. The great explorers, Lewis and Clark, who met in Louisville, Kentucky, to launch their great expedition to the west, may in fact have stopped near present-day Cape Girardeau to consider their future course. On this significant day in the history of Southeast Missouri State University in Cape Girardeau, let us pause to consider directions as we seek to create the course to tomorrow. If we are fortunate in that this morning we have with us two of the most well-known explorers of conservative and liberal ideology in the nation. Senator George McGovern has, for the past quarter century, been identified with liberal causes and new directions in American politics. A two-term member of the House of Representatives and a U.S. Senator for 18 years. Senator McGovern was the 1972 Democratic presidential nominee. Mr. McGovern grew up in a small town in South Dakota, where his father was a Methodist minister. World War II broadened his horizons beyond the prairies as he served as a pilot of the Dakota Queen, a B-24 bomber in which he flew 35 missions and for which he earned the Distinguished Flying Cross. He returned home after the war and did graduate work in American history, earning a PhD at Northwestern University, and returned to South Dakota to become a college history professor. In 1962, he was elected to the U.S. Senate, where he became one of the first members of the U.S. Congress to openly oppose American participation in the Vietnam War. Mr. McGovern served on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee throughout the 1970s and was appointed by both Presidents Carter and Ford as a United Nations delegate. In 1982, he founded Americans for Common Sense, providing an alternative political voice on behalf of minorities, the poor, and other marginalized Americans. Senator McGovern is the author of 4 books: Agricultural Thought in the 20th Century, A Time of War, A Time of Peace, his autobiography, Grassroots, and more recently, Terry, a deeply moving chronicle of his third child's efforts to overcome her addiction to alcohol. Senator McGovern has previously been on our campus, and I would like for you to join with me and welcome him back to Southeast Missouri State University. William F. Buckley is a nationally prominent author, columnist, politician, editor, adventurer, philosopher, lecturer, and television personality. And the list goes on. In 1955, Mr. Buckley founded the conservative journal National Review, which is today the journal of opinion with the largest circulation in America. In 1962, he began his syndicated column On the Right. Today it appears twice a week in over 300 newspapers here and abroad. In 1966, Mr. Buckley began hosting his weekly television show, Firing Line, which is now the longest-running television program in the United States with the same host. Virtually every political and intellectual leader throughout the world has been a guest on the show. He's won an Emmy Award for Program Achievement and the TV Guide Award for the Best Television Interviewer in America. As an author, his diversity holds no bounds. Mr. Buckley is philosophical in God and Man at Yale, Up from Liberalism, and Right Reason. He is autobiographical in Overdrive and The Unmaking of a Mayor. He has written a great number of fictional works, plays, and even children's books. William F. Buckley was born in New York City, graduated with honors from Yale, and has been awarded over 35 honorary degrees. In 1991, he was the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Please welcome to our campus for the first time, Mr. William F. Buckley. Procedures for the debate will be as follows. Mr. Buckley will lead off with 15 minutes allotted for him to outline his views on the question of which is the best guidance for the 21st century, conservative or liberal ideology. Mr. McGovern will then follow with 15 minutes to rebut Mr. Buckley and then deliver his own thoughts on the topic. Mr. Buckley will then have 5 minutes to rebut Mr. McGovern, and following these comments from our two distinguished visitors, we will have questions from a panel consisting of 2 students, 2 faculty members, and 2 members from the Cape Girardeau community. These individuals I'd like to introduce now are Neil E. Boyd, Vice President of Student Government here at Southeast. Ms. Christy Johnson, student representative also to the Southeast Board of Regents. Mr. Howard Meagle, who is the General Manager of KFVS Television in Cape Girardeau. Ms. Ann Poston, Human Resources of the Dana Corporation. And Dr. Alberta Dugan, Chairman of the Department of History at Southeast, and Dr. Peter Bergeson, Chairman of the Department of Political Science here. Following questions from the panel, Mr. Buckley and Mr. McGovern will have approximately 3 to 5 minutes to make their closing remarks. We're very pleased to have here this morning C-SPAN with us to film today's program, and we look forward to the opportunity to view our session on their American Perspectives program. And now, if we can initiate our debate, I would like to introduce to you Mr. William F. Buckley.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, members of the panel, Mr. Chairman, Senator McGovern. I'm very happy to be here and to participate in the august events of the day. I thank you all for the hospitality extended thus far. It is true that yesterday, driving in, Senator McGovern expressed his disappointment that he was not being asked to read his poetry at the inauguration. I told him what he would be doing during the debate is reciting political poetry. Fun to listen to, but not anything to be guided by. Senator McGovern has had a distinguished history, and the American century is very beholden to him, especially beholden to him for not having been elected. We've been asked to suggest guidance into the 21st century and to ask whether in the course of the 20th century we have been primarily armed by developments that tend us in conservative positions or tend us in liberal positions. I think it important to reflect in foreign policy that it has been a very sad century. We've had great climactic victories, but at a very high cost. I was 18 years old when the bomb at Hiroshima went off, and I was a senior citizen when the Berlin Wall came down. The interval was called the Cold War. It's quite true that we won the Cold War, but it's also true that an entire generation began young and ended old before that war was won. That was substantially the result of our failure to do the right thing at the right time. The object of statecraft is to abort crisis. It can be said that we aborted crises in the sense that we did not end the century in a great nuclear blast that consumed the planet. It can't be said that we won the Cold War in the sense of relieving millions upon millions upon millions of people of the terrible lives that took up their entire lifetimes. These were opportunities missed, and opportunities that continue to be missed. We're entitled to ask, are there guidelines that distinguish conservative statecraft from the statecraft commonly thought of as liberal? Paradoxically enough, Mr. McGovern is not in the hard liberal tradition of his own party. The notion that we can and must be responsible for spreading democracy everywhere was most emphatically popularized in this century by Woodrow Wilson, as we all know, and re-emphasized by John F. Kennedy in his inaugural address. Back in 1824, an appetite developed in America to intervene in the War of Austrian Succession. It was on that occasion that President John Adams gave his celebrated speech on the 4th of July, in which he said, "American people are friends of liberty everywhere, but custodians only of their own." That foresight tempered the expansive suggestion that we should send the Marines to every corner of the world in which practices were not identical to our own. We had a sense of the limitations of power, which sense we exercised, attempting to make the relevant distinctions. This was highlighted when we sent the Marines in 1965 to land in the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic occupies the eastern half of a single island of Hispaniola. On the right, on the eastern half, where we did land the Marines, a threat was acknowledged of a Soviet salient, similar to Cuba's. In anticipation of such an effort, we did land the Marines there, and we tended to reorient the situation away from that possibility, as 10 years later we did in Grenada. On the western half of the same island reigned Papa Doc, one of the singular sadists of this century, for which there is much competition. We ignored him, substantially ignored him, because he wasn't a part of an apparatus that sought the destruction of liberty everywhere. That was a kind of a geopolitical distinction very satisfactory to conservative reconnaissance, and one which I would urge on you to pass along to the 21st century after I am no longer there to counsel it. These are distinctions that I urge on the country, and these are in very sharp departure from the consistent calls for disarmament that have characterized Senator McGovern's public career. At one point, when John F. Kennedy was president, he called for one disarmament drive, which was rejected by the Senate by a vote of 76-2, isolating George McGovern as a policymaker where, in my judgment, he belongs to be isolated. Mr. McGovern, in his lust for peace, found himself backing Henry Wallace, a Soviet stooge, in 1948. And now Mr. McGovern is identified with that inscrutable movement that says that we should not spend money to develop an anti-missile missile. This refusal to exploit our own technological resources, given the fact that we live in an age in which more and more countries have the nuclear, have chemical and nuclear and biological means of spreading massive destruction, is an economy that is very difficult to understand. So we want a combination of a provident use of American resources, together with a convincing and emphatic power to have our way when as custodians of the balance of freedom in the world, our efforts become critical. Unhappily, Senator McGovern also has views on domestic policy. Those views on domestic policy can be summarized by his enthusiasm for turning problems on over to the shoulders of the state. It's remarkable how reluctant we are to learn about the impoverishment of handing over social ideals to the government. It was Jefferson who said the government can only do something for you in proportion as it can do something to you, and it was Adams who said the government turns every contingency into an excuse for amassing greater power in its own hands. Woodrow Wilson said the history of liberalism is the history of man's efforts to restrain the growth of government. But have we done anything of the sort? There was a great debate on the welfare bill last year, you may remember. Senator Kennedy, during that debate, asked, had we forgotten what we have accomplished with welfare programs? What have we, in fact, accomplished with them? Since 1960, we spent $2.6 trillion on welfare. Things are here and there a little better, and things are here a little bit worse, and things here and there are really quite a lot worse. Since 1960, there's been a 560% increase in violent crime, more than a 400% increase in illegitimate births, a quadrupling of divorce rates, a tripling of the percentage of children living in single-parent homes, and a drop of 80 points in SAT. Manifestly, there has been a correlation between federal disbursements and the general welfare, but it has been a negative correlation. Let's advise the 21st century to abide by the principle of subsidiarity. The principle of subsidiarity says, if there is a problem, turn it over to the private sector to cope with. If manifestly it can't cope with it, then turn it over to government, but always seek out the lowest echelon of government, not the higher echelon of government. It is the tendency of liberalism instantly to be attracted by total power. The federal government, the power above all to tax, and the power to pass regulations and to pass laws. The failure of the federal government to solve the poverty program is wonderfully manifested by the stark figures. In the year 1900, 90% of the American people were poor by current standards of poverty. That figure diminished to 11, 12, 13% 30 years ago, and it has not moved substantially from there. Surely one of the reasons why it has not moved is because there have been so many inhibitions on the kind of American ingenuity and American resources and the Americans' passion to solve and to attack social problems using those resources. I urge you, therefore, to pass along to the 21st century the wonderful intuition of Alfred North Whitehead, the philosopher. He said, you know, you learn much more in the study of history about any situation, about any era, by examining what it is that people aren't saying. What they aren't saying is what they take for granted. What we are ceasing increasingly to say in America is the extent to which there is a correlation between how much money is spent by the public sector over against how much money is spent by the private sector. Spending by the private sector is money spent in the exercise of individual freedom. The moment it is taken by the public sector, it is transmuted into an anonymous collectivity which seeks to affect goals that appeal to foreign legislators sitting in Washington and squandering our resources. If you want to interrupt me with a burst of applause, I will understand your brother. In any event, I invite Senator McGovern to rewrite history. He is well equipped academically to do that, and I think that sending him to Washington was a terrible loss to the Academy, and we should all grieve for it. Thank you.
Senator McGovern will now make his statement of philosophy looking into the 21st century.
Echo, members of the panel, my friend William Buckley. Let me say, first of all, that I'm pleased to be on this campus of Southeast Missouri State University, and especially in view of a long-time friendship I have had with your president, Dale Nitschke. It's been my privilege since leaving the Senate some 16 years ago to be on campuses all across this country, and I know of no president that I rate above Dale Nitschke. I think you're very fortunate to have him. As Professor Michael has told us, William Buckley is a very distinguished novelist. It's been my privilege and my gain to read most of those novels, and I commend all of them. They're very well done and will hold your attention. The chairman has also reminded you that I'm a historian, so Mr. Buckley and I have reached an agreement about this debate today. As a novelist, he will give you nothing but fiction, and you've already had a sample of that. And as a historian, I will give you nothing but the truth today. I'm going to save most of my rebuttal until the time for the rebuttal in the debate. I'm supposed to give my constructive speech on liberalism at this point, but let me just say I have noted my esteemed sparring partner, Mr. Buckley, has this morning, as he has in other debates, quoted with some approval such liberal Democrats as Woodrow Wilson and John Kennedy. On other occasions, he's even quoted Harry Truman and Franklin Roosevelt. But what I've noted about all of these cases is that in addition to being very distinguished liberals, they're also all now dead. And I once said to Bill, if I promise to die before you do, will you say a few good things about me? He was non-committal. I just want to make one comment at the outset here about my position on disarmament, which has been referred to here today, and also a mention that I had once supported the former Vice President of the United States, former Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Wallace. When World War II came along, Pearl Harbor, I was a sophomore at Dakota Wesleyan University. I was 19 years of age, and I volunteered within 3 months to serve as a bomber pilot in that war. What I discovered is that there were no instructors trained, There were no airplanes available for training purposes. When I say no, I mean grossly inadequate, even not enough training fields. I had to wait for a year before they could take us into service because of that lack of preparedness. I never again want to see the United States in that position. I have always been, without fail, for a strong national defense for the United States. This has been a dangerous world all of my life, and I've always supported a strong national defense. But that did not include backing the policymakers who thought it was in the interest of our defense and security to send our young men to Vietnam. Even the architects, of that mistaken policy now know that it was a dreadful mistake. If you don't believe that, take the time to read Robert McNamara's memoir, one of the chief architects and most consistent advocates of our involvement there. Those of us who criticized American policy there are sometimes branded as weak on defense. Those of us who criticize unnecessary and wasteful military spending that we know something about based on our own service are also sometimes criticized as weak on national defense. Those critics were led by the one five-star general we've had in the White House, President Eisenhower, who warned in his farewell address that a major problem before this country was the mounting power of the military-industrial complex and its capacity to get its way at times when it went beyond the real defense and security requirements of the country. So I don't need a lecture on weakness or on national defense, but I do want to make clear that one of the challenges to both liberals and conservatives is to, as we move into this next century, is to recognize that the Cold War has ended. We've built up a massive military structure around the world that was designed to fight a war simultaneously against the Soviet Union and Communist China. Now the Soviet Union is gone, and China has become our most favored nation trading partner. So we need to look at this massive spending for military purposes and ask ourselves whether we need all of that money to continue going in that direction, or whether some of it should be diverted to rebuilding other sources of national strength, such as our roadways, our bridges, our tunnels, our water and sewage systems, and other things that this country needs that also contribute to national defense and national security. And one of the reasons I support the liberal tradition, although frequently some of my fellow liberals have not stood up on this issue as well as I wish they had, is that I think we have a better chance of leading this country into a balanced view of how we allocate our resources in the 21st century. Let me just add one further thing. I never once, in all of those 10 years of trying to stop our involvement in Vietnam, ever criticized one American soldier. Those soldiers had my full sympathy and understanding and support, and they still do. I can't look at that wall, the Vietnam Wall in Washington with those 58,000 names without a sense of real grief. I mourn the passing of every one of those boys, but it was the policymakers who needed to be challenged, and that's what we're talking about here today. Now, the question that Mr. Buckley and I were originally given was the future of conservative and liberal ideology. Will they survive into the 21st century? I take the view that I earnestly hope both of these time-tested political traditions will survive into the 20th century. I want to see both William F. Buckley and George McGovern make it into the 21st century. And I hope that the traditions, the rival traditions that we represent will continue to flourish, because it's been my conviction for a long time that it is the creative tension and the competition, if you will, of ideas between conservatism on one hand and liberalism on the other that is the real genius of American politics. This is the source of much of our strength, and it's the reason that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, one a liberal, one a conservative, went to their graves admiring each other with affection and approval despite their competing views. I want, as I say, the conservative tradition to be heard, and I want Bill Buckley to continue to be heard, but I don't want him to go unchallenged any more than I think that liberalism and George McGovern should go unchallenged. My mother and father were lifelong conservatives, lifelong Republicans, religious fundamentalists. I was too, until World War II came along, and I traveled around the world for a while, and then came back to Northwestern University, and under the GI Bill of Rights, one of these awful federal programs that Mr. Buckley thinks concentrates too much power in the hands of the federal government. Under that program, I and several million other Americans were educated. That program cost billions of dollars, but we're told that having educated a whole generation of young Americans, it more than paid for itself. The federal government actually made money on it. The taxpayers made money on it. Why? Because those young men and some women were able to increase their earning power to the point where they more than paid back the cost of that investment. And they lifted the quality of American society from that day to this. It's a marvelous example of what a liberal program originally opposed by conservatives can do to move this country forward. Even prior to that, I saw the record of liberalism as a high school student growing up out in the Dust Bowl days in South Dakota. South Dakota is now underwater, but when I was growing up, it was afflicted with dust storms and drought chronically. Farmers were going broke, the banks had failed, people were out of work. It was a desperate place. I don't recall being particularly poor, I guess, because everybody was poor. Certainly Methodist ministers were poor in those days, and I grew up in a parsonage. But what I saw was a positive series of moves by the federal government. Some of them were clumsy, some of them could have been better, but they did things like bringing electricity to the farms of South Dakota, the REA program. They developed the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Missouri River, and other river systems. They put unemployed people to work in the civilian conservation camps. They provided guaranteed bank deposits so the banks could open again with the confidence of their customers. They provided Social Security for our grandparents. They provided work for people building courthouses and roadways and shelter belts and all the rest. And that was the record of liberalism in the period when I was growing up in South Dakota in a Republican party, in a Republican family. But it began to set my own mind thinking about Franklin Roosevelt and later Harry Truman. And then in the decade that followed World War II, we saw not only things like the GI Bill of Rights, we saw the beginning of civil rights. We saw shortly after that movements to build the interstate highway system. Again, the long arm of the federal government that Mr. Buckley spoke about. And we saw a whole range of other programs, including movements to provide equality for women, the environmental movement, the effort to lift the quality of education. This is the liberal agenda. I regret to say that that agenda has sometimes made the most comfortable and most entrenched of our citizens a little nervous. Why? Because you can't do positive things like the GI Bill of Rights and REA and public service jobs when people are unemployed without taxes. It's true, there is no such thing as a free lunch. Somebody has to pay for these things. And there are some people so comfortable in their own resources, they can't understand that there are other needs across this country that do require public expenditure. And so there's been a ceaseless barrage against the whole concept of liberalism over the last 20 years. I regret to say that many of my fellow liberals, instead of standing up to that barrage, have run for cover and have chosen to march under a different banner. I'm still a proud liberal. I believe that this liberal agenda is endorsed by most Americans. I honestly believe that most Americans are liberals, even though many of them are unaware of what the liberal agenda is. If they understood that it embraced Social Security and Medicare and the environmental program and civil rights and the effort to end the war in Vietnam and all of these other things that I've talked about here today, I think most Americans would say that while we need a strong conservative tradition to challenge and check and criticize these liberal initiatives, I think they would also recognize that it is the liberal tradition that has given us most of the forward progress in our society. Let me put it to you this way. I can't think of a single public program now generally endorsed by most Americans, all the way from Ronald Reagan to the Reverend Jesse Jackson, that did not begin as a liberal initiative over conservative opposition. That doesn't mean conservatives are bad. They need to raise criticisms about some of these government initiatives and how they're run. It does mean that we've had to depend on the liberal impulse for most of the gains we've made in modern times. I think the same will be true in the 21st century when we have other problems that need to be addressed, and I've already mentioned one, the need to accept the post-Cold War period and begin to convert carefully some of the unnecessary arms outlays to the rebuilding of this great country. Thank you so much.
Mr. Buckley will now present a 5-minute rebuttal.
Senator McGovern says he doesn't need a lecture on defense. After all, the Cold War is over. In 1967, he voted against the ABM financing. In 1969, he said that negotiating from strength is one of the most damaging and costly cliches of the American vocabulary. In 1970, he wanted to get out of NATO. He wanted to stop the ABM and the MERV and the AMSA conventions. In 1971, he said about ABM, he thought it temporarily, at any event, it should be halted even unilaterally. In 1971, he wanted to cut 50% off the defense budget. That was during the days of the Cold War. These are simply his pacific impulses. They have to do with, I think, a quite general misunderstanding about how it is that that things get accomplished. What needed to be accomplished during the Cold War was to win it. In order to win it, we had to have a preponderance of strength. In order to have a preponderance of strength, we had to finance a defense industry. The notion that all of that is happening that we approve of is somehow financed by the wispy creation of money somewhere is, of course, the great delusion of modern liberalism. What was it in 1873 that caused the founding of this college? It was not any act of Washington, D.C., of any importance. What was it that caused the huge engine that slowly wiped away poverty for 90% of the American people? It wasn't anything done by Washington. It was things done by people like Edison and Ford and millions of other entrepreneurs. The whole notion that we should be grateful to the government for good health or for good education belies the central point. If I'm going to school and I'm not paying for it, somebody else is paying for it. Who is that person? If I'm getting medical care and I'm not paying for it, somebody else is paying for it. The notion of the mysteriously accumulating dollar in Washington, D.C. is the principal hallucination fostered by contemporary American liberalism. In fact, as in the case of Missouri, 0.5% more money is spent from Washington to this state than the other way around. You are financing your own ventures for all intents and purposes. And money that sends to Washington, go to Washington, comes back here, spends an expensive night out on the town in Washington. And there is an attrition in that dollar that is returned to you. It is necessary in exploring the notion of what we learn from one another to engage the idea of progress. The traditional method philosophically and scientifically is thesis, antithesis, but then comes synthesis. I certainly would expect for the rest of my lifetime to learn from George McGovern and indeed from other liberals, but I am asking for a rejection of that which we have learned does not work. What is the answer to the crowning American problem of the day, which is very simply this: illegitimacy? For every illegitimate child, you have a 600% statistical increase in crime and poverty and dope addiction. What is it that liberalism tells us about illegitimacy? Only that we can't pray in schools. I think that's the most creative thing that they've ever come up with on this particular subject. So that liberalism refuses to accost genuine reality, preferring instead simply to cite free electricity in South Dakota 50 years ago. It wasn't free electricity. Somebody had to pay for it. I'm delighted they had electricity there, though maybe if George McGovern as a child had read one fewer books, he might have enlightened us more.
Senator McGovern will now have 5 minutes for his rebuttal.
Let me just pick up again on this point on the votes on the arms budget, because I think that is important. Every American wants this country to be adequately defended. No one is advocating that we strip our defenses to the point where we're unable to protect American security. It's true, some of these items that my friend Mr. Buckley has mentioned did have me in opposition. I was opposed to the ABM. We find that's the anti-ballistic missile system as it stood then. It was widely assailed by some of the best defense experts in the country as a mistake. We finally agreed to build one of them in North Dakota. If you want to see the biggest white elephant in the American defense arsenal, sometime when you're in North Dakota, ask to visit the ABM, which is up there collecting dust and moss, which provides nothing in the way of real defense for this country, but which cost us $6 billion for that failed experiment. I have always believed that the best way to defend ourselves against nuclear attack is the route that most of our presidents have taken, which is to negotiate arms reduction agreements with the former Soviet Union rather than starting a second arms race as to who can build the greatest defensive system against the other's missiles. All that does is to trigger the other country and to increase their offensive missiles. You never win on that proposition, and I think we've finally come to discover that. I might add that if you had to identify the principal causes for the collapse of the Soviet Union, why this system fell, in addition to the fact that Soviet communism was simply a lousy system, it was made even lousier by the fact that the Russians were spending so much of their resources in this arms race with the United States. Tens of thousands of strategic weapons of all kinds that they now love to find some way to get rid of. And I do not want to see the United States go that route. We're a much wealthier country. We can afford an arms race like that better than the Soviets, and that's one of the reasons why they went down and we triumphed. But we don't need to automatically continue this arms accumulation into the future at a time when no really significant military power is challenging us anywhere in the world. We defeated the Iraqi army in a few days with the commitment of 17% of our armed forces. Just now it's hard to see anybody else that presents any greater threat to the United States. So I think we need to keep those things in mind. With regard to George McGovern having cast a vote at one time to reduce the military budget, incidentally, the amount I was proposing was a 2% reduction in military outlays at a time when the defense budget was $100 billion. It's true that vote came out 76-2. That doesn't necessarily mean that 2 people were wrong and 76 were right. It could be the other way around. Did you ever think of that? On the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964 that President Johnson presented to the Senate, in effect giving him a blank check to escalate the war in Vietnam, I went along with that resolution. So did 98 senators. The vote was 98-2 in support of that resolution. Only Senator Morris of Oregon and Senator Greening of Alaska had the wisdom and the courage to stand up against it. They were right. The other 98 of us were wrong on that vote. I'm not embarrassed about the votes in the Senate where I stood alone or with 2 or 3 other people. The ones that embarrass me are the ones where I sometimes went along with the crowd when I should have stood firm. So, and with regard to Mr. Buckley's other central argument here, that these domestic programs that I talk about are fine, but they cost money and they run up debts and deficits, I simply want to say this. I suppose if I were to pull out Mr. Buckley's heroes politically, they would not really be Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt or John Kennedy or Harry Truman. They'd more likely be Ronald Reagan. You know what happened to federal spending and deficit financing and the national debt during those 8 Reagan years? It tripled the national debt. The biggest annual deficits in our 200-year history, the biggest national debt. I recognize the Congress went along with that, and it was a Democratic Congress much of that time. They could have blocked that, but even if they had accepted the Reagan budget just the way it was submitted every year, that budget that was being offered would have tripled the national debt, as indeed it did. I'm not for that kind of reckless deficit spending. spending. And I think that very few Americans, if they stop to think about it, are. So I don't want to transfer so many obligations to the federal government that we have to run deficits and debts at that level. I do believe in fiscal integrity, and I think that's a mark of a responsible liberal.
We will now turn to our panel for questions, beginning with Mr. Neil Boyd. Mr. Boyd is a speech communication major from Sikeston, Missouri, and vice president of student government. Mr. Boyd.
Again, I would like to say thank you for coming, Mr. Buckley, Senator McGovern. Being a student involved in politics and at an age where my own political ideology is being shaped by researching candidates, issues, and listening to various amounts of political rhetoric, my question is, at what point in your own lives did you begin developing your conservative and liberal beliefs? And what role do you see for politically active youth in shaping or reforming modern political thought for generations to come?
That's good. Well, I never was a liberal. I guess I just should acknowledge grace as the lucky provider in my case.
Well, I can't say that I was not a conservative, because I was. I was reared that way in South Dakota, and by my devout parents, whom I admired then. I admire them even more after all these years. They gave me a moral underpinning that I think has been the greatest strength of anything I've had to offer in public life. But I began to hear those liberal impulses during the Depression in South Dakota. I saw people really suffering. It wasn't because they didn't work. I saw farmers that worked from dawn until dusk who were going broke, and bankers and small business people who were working from dawn until dusk who were going broke. And we really had to do something. South Dakota voted Democratic a couple of times in those years. I think my parents voted Republican. But I began to see things happening in that state that I thought were in the interest of everybody. I have to confess to you, my wife has a letter that I sent her from Italy during World War II, in which I was telling her why she should vote for Dewey instead of Roosevelt. So at least through 1944, I guess you'd have to classify me as a conservative. But those years at Northwestern in graduate school studying American history turned me around. We used to have an old Republican neighbor, Mrs. Truax, very dear friend of our family. She always said that George got off the track when he went to that big college in Chicago. And I suppose that's true. From the perspective of securities, that's where I began to move in a more liberal direction, to which I've held more or less from that day to this. The second part of the question has me saying that I still believe in American politics. I still think it's an honorable profession, and I would encourage the best young people here to think about it as a possible career.
We'll now have a question from Dr. Peter Bergeson, Chairman of the Department of Political Science.
Good morning. My question is, how do your respective political ideologies give us a guide to a peace settlement in the Middle East, particularly presently with the Israeli and Palestinians? Senator McGovern.
Well, I've headed the Middle East Policy Council. It's a nonprofit educational group for the last 5 or 6 years. I used to be chairman of the Senate subcommittee on the Middle East. So I've been interested in that area for a long time. I have always felt that the long-term solution to the Middle East crisis depends on a settlement of the Palestinian question first. The Palestinians have long wanted an independent entity or homeland of their own. It's difficult for me to understand why so many Israelis who also want an independent homeland and love their country very dearly, understandably, why they have so much difficulty understanding that impulse on the part of Palestinians. I think if there's to be a settlement there has to be a certain amount of tolerance and humanity on both sides. There's no place for terrorism in any of this, and there's no place for the kind of rigidity and unyielding stubbornness that we sometimes see on both sides. I'm especially concerned about Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu. I wish with all my heart that Shimon Peres had won the Israeli election. I think that's the view of most American Jewish citizens, as well as my view, because I think had that happened, the Oslo agreement could have been implemented. There would have been more concessions on territory, on boundaries, on settlements, on the future status of Jerusalem. All those things are going to happen if there's going to be peace in the Middle East. And it may very well be that our own President and Secretary of State are going to have to stand a little firmer on insisting on concessions on the part of all the parties if this peace process is to move ahead.
No comment.
The second student member of our panel is Miss Christy Johnson from Cooter, Missouri, an accounting major and the student representative to the University Board of Regents. Ms. Johnson?
Thank both of you for being here with us this morning. Senator McGovern mentioned earlier the GI Bill, which allowed him to obtain an education, and I think that the need for education is evident in every mind. However, there are clear differences in the way conservatives and liberals view exactly to what extent the public is responsible for educating its citizens and exactly how. And in that light, my question is, how important will higher education be to the 21st century, and is it the government's responsibility to ensure that each citizen has the opportunity to obtain a four-year college degree?
Was that yours? Well, the answer is no. I don't think it's the government's responsibility to insist that people go to school. Up to a certain point, we accept that, 15, 16 years old, whatever it is. But even though it's statistically provable that in most cases people generate more money, about 30% more if they go to college than if they don't go to college, we still are a society that honors the right of people to go their own way. The notion that people necessarily ought to go to college is one of those great wonderful, endearing American superstitions. As things stand right now, 25% of people, this is figures as of 2 years ago, who matriculate in college do not go on to sophomore year. And 50% of those who matriculate in college do not graduate. Now, this isn't necessarily because they run out of money. It may be because they run into academic problems that they can't handle, or it may be that they get married and do other things. Rush Limbaugh, as his mother was telling me a moment ago, made it only through one class here. He's done all right. Gore Vidal never went to college. He does all right. We really should do away with the superstition that unless you go to college, you you are in some way contemptible. It's wonderful to go to college, and people make wonderful sacrifices to make it possible, but there ought to be a suggestion that admission to high sanctuaries in American life are only for those who have gone to college. They should be welcomed in whatever enterprise they undertake.
I agree with a considerable amount of what Mr. Buckley has just said. I think a college education is desirable for most young people. There are some who are probably better suited to go in a different direction. It's my own further feeling that given the crisis in our budget right now, we can't afford to underwrite a free four-year education for everyone. I think it's not in the cards right now in terms of the fiscal condition of the country. Even if it were desirable, it's not within our reach. Having said earlier, though, that the GIs educated after World War II, and of course there weren't nearly as many of them as there are people who might like to go to college today, more than paid for their education, I think that's a strong case for strengthening the student loan program that we've now had on the statute books for many years. Instead of cutting back on that program, I think the President is right in stressing that we strengthen it. Those loans, in my opinion, are pretty good risks. It does put a burden on young people after they graduate, but that education has also given them tools that, according to all the statistics, enable them to earn more and therefore to gain the capacity to retire such loans. So that's the direction in which I would go, to make sure that we have a strong, guaranteed loan program and make it as widely available as practical.
The next question will be posed by Ms. Ann Poston, who works in the area of human resources with the Dana Corporation.
My question is regarding health care. With health care costs becoming an increasingly larger percentage of the GNP each year, what changes do you foresee in health care in the future? And what, if any, role do you see the government playing in bringing those changes about?
Well, we knew we had to do something about the galloping cost of health care. A straight extrapolation of its growth during the first 5 years of this decade would have shown it in the year 2021 as consuming 100% of the national product. So it had to begin to dip, and it has. This last year, it increased by 2.2%, with inflation increasing by 2.3%. So it narrowly edged out inflation. However, it's caused a lot of dissatisfaction. The healthcare program is, as somebody remarked recently, in its adolescence. There are all kinds of dissatisfactions. A lot of doctors are unhappy for very interesting and good reasons. A lot of patients are unhappy. Inevitably, one has to go in the direction of deductibility. The person who is mischievously and voluptuously health-minded can use up an awful lot of money that need not necessarily be spent. And there are very few market enticements, or have been, to do the right thing. Somebody pointed out a year and a half ago, if you wanted a blood test in Houston, you could go to 8 different places and get it for prices ranging from $15 to $84. There was zero sanction to go to the $15 place rather than the $82 place under the majority of insurance policies. Something that works in the marketplace principle has got to be admitted into it. Remember, we're spending 13% of our gross national product on health. The Brits, with their socialized system, are spending 8. Canadians, with their socialized system, are spending 8.2. so that we are wildly extravagant, even by the terms of state-run industries?
I think one of the encouraging trends in American health these days is that more and more Americans are becoming health conscious and are taking the kind of preventive steps that will keep them healthy. I think there needs to be more of that, more of an emphasis both in American medical practice and also on the part of all of us, of individuals, of doing certain common sense things that keep us from getting sick. I'm talking about watching the diet. I'm talking about watching the alcohol and nicotine intake. I'm talking about exercise. Bill Buckley works as hard as anybody I know. He's one of the hardest working human beings in this country. But I notice that he's always got his weight under control. He goes out and exercises every day. He watches his diet with some measure of common sense. And this is what all of us have to do if we want to live long, happy, healthy lives. Now, beyond that, sometimes we're going to get sick, no matter how much emphasis we put on prevention. I hope those prevention efforts can begin right down at the kindergarten level with our children, where we teach prevention and common sense health measures. But there are probably 35 million Americans in this country who have no health insurance. And when they get sick, they're in trouble. They don't have enough income to pay the premiums. There are other middle-income people who are finding it increasingly hard to pay these escalating hospital and medical costs, and we have to do something about that. This may seem unrealistic given the present political climate in the country, but I still believe that comprehensive national health insurance is the way to go. I think it would be better for the doctors. I think it would be better for the hospitals, for the nurses, and I think it would be better for the patients. I would insist under any such system that people have a right to choose their own doctor and their own medical care. But I do think that as the only industrialized country in the world that does not have a system of comprehensive national health care, that as we move into the 21st century, that ought to be high on the list of goals for this country. I don't believe this managed care system is going to work very well. I heard a story the other day about 3 people that arrived at the pearly gates at the same time. A doctor who told St. Peter he'd always ministered to the health of his patients. St. Peter said, "Go into eternal life and enjoy it." A nurse comes along, makes the same claim. He said, "Go into the pearly gates, enjoy your eternal life." The next person said, "I'm the director of a managed care program." He said, "Go in through the pearly gates and stay for 3 days." This is one of the problems with managed care. There's too much of the bottom line profit making for those who manage those systems and not enough concern about the well-being of the patient. I'm for national health insurance.
We will now turn to Mr. Howard Meikle, the General Manager of KFVS Television.
I'm delighted to be here today. I'm curious as to your opinions on the campaign process as it is today, and is it the best process in your mind for going into the new millennium? It seems to have degraded to sniping rather than discussing issues and being elected by tearing down your opponent. I wonder if I would be interested in your opinions on how or what should be done to change it.
Bill is deferring to me as a practitioner of politics one time, although he He waged a valiant campaign for mayor of New York at one time. Let me say that I think one of the unfortunate things that has happened to American politics was the emergence of these little 30-second paid ads on television. Television is a marvelous instrument for the education and pleasure and the enlightenment of the American people. I don't know that I ever could have been elected to office in South Dakota without television in an essentially Republican state. But I would have to say I'm worried about the reducing of campaign dialogue, the kind of thing that Mr. Buckley and I have been doing here today under rather relaxed and open circumstances, to little 30-second sound bites. I wouldn't worry about that so much if it weren't for the drift towards almost pure negative advertising in those ads. You can say positive things in 30 seconds about what you want to do for the public, but you can also say mean, nasty things about your opponent, and regrettably, those are the things that seem to stick in people's minds. Too many cases, we've had good people in this country defeated by negative advertising. Thoughtful people who were trying to serve the public interest, whose images are warped and distorted by these massive TV campaigns, largely in the 30-second and 60-second spots. If you'll pardon a personal reference, I think I was one of the victims of that type of thing back in 1972. That's not the only reason I lost. Perhaps no one could have won against an incumbent president as entrenched as President Nixon. But if you go back and look at the blizzard of negative campaign spots that were directed against me in that campaign with enormous sums of money, you might be puzzled as to how I got any votes in 72. I scarcely recognize myself from that incessant distorting campaign. So I've been against that tactic. I don't know what you can do about it other than to encourage more of the kind of open and free-flowing debate that Mr. Buckley and I have been privileged to participate in here today.
The answer is, of course, there's nothing you can do about it, because with New York Times versus Sullivan, which is, 32 years old, you can't sue unless you can prove actual malice. And in a political campaign, it's almost impossible to do so. Some 8 years before Senator McGovern ran, Goldwater was paraded as the person who would intentionally and delightedly begin a nuclear war. So that the only way to get any historical perspective on it is, for instance, go back a few years, study what was said in the Jefferson-Adams campaign. It makes it sound absolutely effete by contrast. In terms of reforms, it is, I think, terribly important to accept the postulates. The postulates are, number one, we're not going to repeal the First Amendment. If we're not going to repeal the First Amendment, then people are, roughly speaking, free to say what they want about each other. Number two, there is no way in which you can, in fact, repeal the right of people to spend what they want to spend to promote their ideas. Buckley versus Vallejo, named after my brother, a Supreme Court decision, said that you can't repeal the First Amendment, and the First Amendment allows you to spend what you want. The best they could do was attempt to say, well, the money must be spent on behalf of ideas. It must not be put at the disposal of a single candidate. Blah, blah, blah. The answer is, since 1976, when that law was passed, there has been this soaring increase. The only way to handle this is to have zero restrictions, but require instantaneous accountability. Put it all on internet within 24 hours and find out who is giving what, and let the American people simply make adjustments based on that. What we're getting now is simply phony restrictions. They don't work, and rising costs. I would certainly join George McGovern happily in any idea of a board, an ethical board that attunes itself to flagrant violations of civil discourse, at least attempting to ring down on malefactors the kind of censure with which they should be disciplined.
Our final question will come from Dr. Alberta Dugan, chairperson of the Department of History here at Southeast.
Well, let's see, which of the thousands of questions that have come up this morning should I ask? But I would like to welcome you to our campus. And I guess considering the tone of the morning and the notion of, will liberalism and conservatism last into the 21st century?
Can you speak a little louder, please?
Excuse me. My question for you is, what do you believe will be the major political issues that will be carried into the 21st century, and what part will the liberals and the conservatives play in regard to each of those issues?
I'm glad you asked me that, because about 15 years ago, I found myself moderating an exchange on what would be the big issues 20 years from now. And one of the participants was the futurist of The Economist magazine, who reminded the audience that Walter Bagehot, the founder of The Economist, had decreed that every 10 years, The Economist should have an entire issue devoted to what were the principal predictable problems of the next 10 years. And he was deputized as the futurist in charge of this enterprise, and had spent the month before this particular meeting going back on issues of The Economist dating back to 1850. He said the only thing you could say reliably about all of them is that they were all wrong. I.e., nobody in The Economist ever predicted what would be the crowning problems 10 years hence. The problems that I've heard in my lifetime were that we would all be consumed in a nuclear war, that we would run out of geographical space for people to live in, that there would be massive permanent unemployment. What in fact have been the problems? They haven't been exactly those. Nobody predicted the problem of wild illegitimacy back in 1960. Any suggestion that it was a correlation of poverty is absolutely incorrect. Back when the blacks were poor, way back before the civil rights legislation, the illegitimacy rate was on the order of 4 or 5%. It's now 63%. Among whites, it's risen as a percentage more, from 6 to 18%, 300%. Now, I'd like to think that 10 years from now, that won't be a problem, but I can't persuade myself. I really think it's going to be the great problem, the disassembly of the American family. The deconstruction of the American family is the great problem of the future. Now, you say, what can conservatives bring to that? I invited in my column everybody who had a view as to what ought to be done about single-parent families to contribute their views. And I had 450 letters. That's a lot. And I went over them very, very carefully. The answer is people don't know what to do. But they do believe that, at least the majority believe, that there ought to be a mobilized sense of right and wrong in situations like this. These 17-year-old, 18-year-old boy who fathers a child without any intention of paying any attention to it for the rest of that child's life is committing a very grave offense against the mother, against the child. And it's one thing to say, well, we don't want to go back to the days of the Scarlet Letter. Well, no, we don't want to go through that. On the other hand, let's acknowledge that the Scarlet Letter established something. People didn't want to be publicly identified as the father of or mother of a child out of wedlock. Newspaper state flirts with ways to reduce divorce rate. District Judge so-and-so of so-and-so Michigan believes there are too many divorces, 68 for every 100 marriages. That's going in the wrong direction, but that's one step very far removed from creating children without any sense of responsibility for what it is that you're doing. And as I say, to what extent is there detectable activity that, however tangentially bears on the problem? Well, we're not allowed to hang the 10 Commandments in a public school. Some dizzy fanatic believes that that's more important than to hang the 10 Commandments and refer to them and point to the moral responsibilities implicit that were a part of Revelation 4,000 years ago. So I would say that that is the problem we have right now that's absolutely palpable. Yes, you can say in the year 2012, China, extrapolated, will have a defensive and offensive force equal to our own. I won't be around, but those of you who are will simply have to face that problem when it comes. I hope it's not faced by a population that's 90% born to a single parent.
You want me to comment briefly? I think there, in addition to the issues that Mr. Buckley has mentioned, I think there are a few things I'd like to just quickly mention. We haven't talked much about the environment here today, but this physical universe that we've been given by Providence is a very precious treasure. And I think that that's an issue that has to be near the top of the list of the 21st century, how we protect the waterways, the oceans, the forests, the land, the air, and the other things that sustain life on this planet. I've already mentioned the health care problem, and that has to be close to the top. I would wager that on any survey in depth, that's a concern that's still very profound with the American people. On the welfare issue, I don't think we've resolved it simply by ending the welfare rolls. I think that wherever people on those welfare rolls are either unqualified or unable to find jobs, they have to be trained. And if they can't find jobs in the private sector, then we've got to come up with useful things they can do in the public sector. And if we're going to take these young mothers out of the home and require them to work in jobs outside of the house, then we've got to provide adequate daycare for the children at home. Incidentally, if you want to make some of those young mothers furious, just suggest that they're doing nothing now. It's not easy to raise a batch of little kids, particularly in a miserable house, in a bad neighborhood, and with no man around. So they're already burdened. But if we want them to get out of those circumstances and work outside the home, somebody has to look after the children. There's another issue that has come to my attention. I just want to mention it in passing. It's the issue of alcoholism and other drug addictions in this country. There are, of course, other drug addictions, but alcoholism is far and away the most widespread and the most destructive. We really need to do more about that problem. There's still, at least in my mind, more questions than there are answers about why nearly 20 million Americans are addicted to alcohol. Most of us can take a drink or two without any problem, but there are about 10% of Americans who can't drink at all without going all the way into blackouts and collapses and all the rest. We need to know more about how to prevent that and how to treat it. One comment on global security that Mr. Buckley has properly identified here today. I think that for 40 years the United Nations was at least quasi-paralyzed by the Cold War, the standoff between Moscow and Washington, in which they repeatedly tied up the machinery of the UN because of differing views. Now they tend to vote together in the UN, and I think for the first time we have an opportunity to beef up that organization. It might begin with us paying our dues, and it needs American leadership and American strength to turn it into the kind of peacekeeping and peacemaking instrumentality that the founders intended. We also need to strengthen the World Court. I don't want to see the United States attempt to be the world's policeman all by ourselves. We have an important role to play, but we have neither the mission nor the capability to settle all these trouble spots around the globe. This calls for stronger and more responsible action on the part of the United Nations and the World Court. Those are issues on which I think liberalism is perhaps better positioned to take us into the 21st century than conservatism.
Well, I've been asked by the chairman to reduce my rebuttal to just a sentence or two. I do feel obliged to make the following point about my hero Ronald Reagan, which is that it's quite true that the national debt went haywire, but it's also true that he reduced the deficit, he reduced the rate at which the deficit was accumulating to 70% of the rate during the preceding 15 years. He also liberated during that period through tax reductions, to be sure, reductions that had been initiated in 1978, and before that, reductions that had been initiated at the promptings of not Eisenhower, not Nixon, but LBJ and Kennedy. He teases me about being in favor of quoting liberals in certain circumstances. The difference between us is that I quote liberals when they do good things, and he quotes them when they do bad things. Woodrow Wilson's statement about defining liberalism, the history of man's efforts to restrain the government, was written in 1881 in his book, Congressional Government, a book which he pretty much deplored when he became president of the United States and started to find out what fun it was to tell people what to do. I thank you so much for your hospitality. I thank Senator McGovern for his friendship. I admire his constancy. I thank the panel and the chairman, and join in the congratulations to President Nitschke. Thank you.
This concludes our debate. Both Senator McGovern and Mr. Buckley have an airplane to catch momentarily. We hope you have enjoyed the exploration with us this morning. We hope you can attend the inaugural ceremonies this afternoon at 2 o'clock in the Show Me Center. For those of you who are present who are involved with the luncheon and processional, there will be shuttle buses behind Academic Hall here, which will take you to the recreation and Show Me centers. Thank you very much for coming.
American Perspectives continues in a minute with columnist Suzanne Fields talking about the impact of feminism on America. Every Saturday night, American Perspectives brings you a look at the cultural and historical side of U.S. politics. Next Saturday,
have approximately 3 to 5 minutes to make their closing remarks. We're very pleased to have here this morning C-SPAN with us to film today's program, and we look forward to the opportunity to view our session on their American Perspectives program. And now, if we can initiate our debate, I would like to introduce to you Mr. William F. Buckley.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, members of the panel, Mr. Chairman, Senator McGovern. I'm very happy to be here and to participate in the august events of the day. I thank you all for the hospitality extended thus far. It is true that yesterday, driving in, Senator McGovern expressed his disappointment that he was not being asked to read his poetry at the inauguration. I told him what he would be doing during debate is reciting political poetry. Fun to listen to, but not anything to be guided by. Senator McGovern has had a distinguished history, and the American century is very beholden to him, especially beholden to him for not having been elected. We've been asked to suggest guidance into the 21st century and to ask whether in the course of the 20th century we have been primarily armed by developments that tend us in conservative positions or tend us in liberal positions. I think it important to reflect in foreign policy that it has been a very sad century. We've had great climactic victories, but at a very high cost.
The theme of this inaugural week is Creating Tomorrow. And this morning we will explore that theme in the form of a debate on the topic of the future of conservative and liberal ideology, which is the best guide into the 21st century. This seems an appropriate debate topic for us, so close here to the Mississippi River, with its many tributaries, and a river so prominent in our history, including a key phrase in the university alma mater. Perhaps we should think about the early explorers of America's rivers and try to imagine what it must have been like for them as they moved against the current, pausing frequently to determine if they should follow the right or the left tributary. The great explorers, Lewis and Clark, who met in Louisville, Kentucky, to launch their great expedition to the west, may, in fact, have stopped near present-day Cape Girardeau to consider their future course. On this significant day in the history of Southeast Missouri State University in Cape Girardeau, let us pause to consider directions as we seek to create the course to tomorrow. If we are fortunate in that this morning we have with us two of the most well-known explorers of conservative and liberal ideology in the nation. Senator George McGovern has, for the past quarter century, been identified with liberal causes and new directions in American politics. A two-term member of the House of Representatives and a U.S. Senator for 18 years. Senator McGovern was the 1972 Democratic presidential nominee. Mr. McGovern grew up in a small town in South Dakota, where his father was a Methodist minister. World War II broadened his horizons beyond the prairies as he served as a pilot of the Dakota Queen, a B-24 bomber in which he flew 35 missions and for which he earned the Distinguished Flying Cross. He returned home after the war and did graduate work in American history, earning a PhD at Northwestern University, and returned to South Dakota to become a college history professor. In God and Man at Yale, Up from Liberalism and Right Reason. He is autobiographical in Overdrive and The Unmaking of a Mayor. He has written a great number of fictional works plays, and even children's books. William F. Buckley was born in New York City, graduated with honors from Yale, and has been awarded over 35 honorary degrees. In 1991, he was the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Please welcome to our campus for the first time, Mr. William F. Buckley. Procedures for the debate will be as follows. Mr. Buckley will lead off with 15 minutes allotted for him to outline his views on the question of which is the best guidance for the 21st century, conservative or liberal ideology. Mr. McGovern will then follow with 15 minutes to rebut Mr. Buckley and then deliver his own thoughts on the topic. Mr. Buckley will then have 5 minutes to rebut Mr. McGovern, and following these comments from our two distinguished visitors, we will have questions from a panel consisting of 2 students, 2 faculty members, and 2 members from the Cape Girardeau community. These individuals I'd like to introduce now are Neil E. Boyd, Vice President of Student Government here at Southeast. Ms. Christy Johnson, student representative also to the Southeast Board of Regents. Mr. Howard Meagle, who is the General Manager of KFVS Television in Cape Girardeau. Ms. Ann Poston, Human Resources of the Dana Corporation. And Dr. Alberta Dugan, Chairman of the Department of History at Southeast, and Dr. Peter Bergeson, Chairman of the Department of Political Science here. Following questions from the panel, Mr. Buckley and Mr. McGovern will have. In 1962, he was elected to the U.S. Senate, where he became one of the first members of the U.S. Congress to openly oppose American participation in the Vietnam War. Mr. McGovern served on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee throughout the 1970s and was appointed by both Presidents Carter and Ford as a United Nations delegate. In 1982, he founded Americans for Common Sense, providing an alternative political voice on behalf of minorities, the poor, and other marginalized Americans. Senator McGovern is the author of 4 books: Agricultural Thought in the 20th Century, A Time of War, A Time of Peace, his autobiography, Grassroots, and more recently, Terry, a deeply moving chronicle of his 3rd child's efforts to overcome her addiction to alcohol. Senator McGovern has previously been on our campus, and I would like for you to join with me and welcome him back to Southeast Missouri State University. William F. Buckley is a nationally prominent author, columnist, politician, editor, adventurer, philosopher, lecturer, and television personality. And the list goes on. In 1955, Mr. Buckley founded the conservative journal National Review, which is today the journal of opinion with the largest circulation in America. In 1962, he began his syndicated column On the Right. Today it appears twice a week in over 300 newspapers here and abroad. In 1966, Mr. Buckley began hosting his weekly television show, Firing Line, which is now the longest-running television program in the United States with the same host. Virtually every political and intellectual leader throughout the world has been a guest on the show. He has won an Emmy Award for Program Achievement and the TV Guide Award for the Best Television Interviewer in America. As an author, his diversity holds no bounds. Mr. Buckley is philosophical.
I was 18 years old when the bomb at Hiroshima went off, and I was a senior citizen when the Berlin Wall came down. The interval was called the Cold War, it's quite true that we won the Cold War, but it's also true that an entire generation began young and ended old before that war was won. That was substantially the result of our failure to do the right thing at the right time. The object of statecraft is to abort crisis. It can be said that we aborted crises in the sense that we did not end the century in a great nuclear blast that consumed the planet. It can't be said that we won the Cold War in the sense of relieving millions upon millions upon millions of people of the terrible lives that took up their entire lifetimes. These were opportunities missed, and opportunities that continue to be missed. We're entitled to ask, are there guidelines that distinguish conservative statecraft from the statecraft commonly thought of as liberal? Paradoxically enough, Mr. McGovern is not in the hard liberal tradition of his own party. The notion that we can and must be responsible for spreading democracy everywhere was most emphatically popularized in this century by Woodrow Wilson, as we all know, and re-emphasized by John F. Kennedy in his inaugural address. Back in 1824, an appetite developed in America to intervene in the War of Austrian Succession. It was on that occasion that President John Adams gave his celebrated speech on the 4th of July, in which he said, "American people are friends of liberty everywhere, but custodians only of their own." That foresight tempered the expansive suggestion that we should send the Marines to every corner of the world